because away from the upland plain, the Chinese Civil War was still raging. Everyone who joined Mao's forces received basic military training. Besides being taught how to handle weapons, they were also given lessons in tactics.
The little formula on how to fight guerrilla warfare he made up from his experience on the way up the mountain, because at the beginning of the experience they lost battles, they were defeated. And then he figured out what is the way to fight so we can win. And he made up these 16 characters in Chinese which rhyme, and they made a nice little rhyme that any country boy could recite. Very simple. The enemy advances, we retreat. Enemy camps, we harass. Enemy tires, we attack. Enemy retreats, we pursue. Very simple.
The Red Army grew steadily. The Revolutionary War is a war of the masses, Mao said. It can only be waged by mobilizing the masses and by trusting in the masses. In fighting the Kuomintang, army commanders learnt vital lessons, which Mao concisely summarized.
No question, never gamble. Never fight unless you outnumber the enemy forces by at least 3 or 4 times. Even better, 9 or 10 times. And never fight when you can't win quickly, before he has a chance to move up tanks and planes and so on. Otherwise, don't fight.
Red Army recruits were mainly rural workers and small farmers, and many were extremely young. They weren't always armed. Often they weren't even wearing shoes or straw sandals. This is how the German communist magazine AIZ described their appearance in 1933. Young red China appears. Drums are heard in the mountains. They are canvassing for the Red Army. The cadres of the young Red Guards are growing. They're nearly all still children. They are marching barefoot against the imperialist robbers, fighting with lances and scythes against the machine guns of the Kuomintang army. Besides Mao, it was mainly the 2 commanders, Zhou Enlai and Zhu De, who made a name for themselves. In 1937, the harrowing civil war had already lasted for more than 10 years. By now, the Red Army consisted almost entirely of infantry. Contrary to what the propaganda claimed, time and again people deserted. But here too, Mao's ideological pragmatism shone through.
The fascinating thing was how he would learn from his own mistakes and change his way of working. For example, at first, anyone who deserted from the Revolutionary Army, if they were caught, they were shot in front of the other troops to teach them a lesson. But life was hard, men were hungry, they were tired, the enemy was in hot pursuit, and more deserted. So he changed the policy entirely. And he gathered all the troops together and announced, from now on, if you want to go, go. As long as you don't take your rifle. The rifle was revolutionary property. That was done, so fewer people deserted. They knew they could go anytime. And he continued that policy right through to the end of the war.
But the war suddenly took a surprising twist. Japan began to invade the whole of China. The aggressors planned to subjugate all of Asia. In December 1938, Japanese troops carried out a massacre in Nanking, which claimed around 300,000 lives. Mao's and Chiang Kai-shek's 2 hostile camps joined forces to repel the invaders. Together, they managed to keep the Japanese in check on the common front. The occupying Japanese forces committed numerous other war crimes, which in the end prompted the United States to impose sanctions. When Japanese bombers then attacked the US Pacific base at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the regional conflict had become a world war. In China, the invaders continued to occupy the east of the country. Millions were fleeing. Finally, it was foreign forces who put an end to the war. On August 6, 1945, at Hiroshima in Japan, the United States deployed a weapon of staggering destructive force. Three days later, a second atom bomb was dropped over Nagasaki, claiming 100,000 lives. On September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. Chiang Kai-shek saw himself as the victor. The Americans gave the Generalissimo generous financial and military support because they wanted to establish China as a buffer zone between their area of interest in the Pacific and that of the Soviet Union. The start of the Cold War was having an initial effect in East Asia too. But for well over a year, Mao had also been in contact with American negotiators. In summer 1944, he had welcomed US officers he had had specially flown into Yan'an as our friends. He saw the visit by an American delegation as a gain in prestige. But the main purpose of the Dixie mission, as it was called, was to reconcile the Chinese Communist Party with the Kuomintang in order to stabilize the country. The US had no interest in a communist victory. At the end of 1945, Mao traveled to Chongqing for negotiations.
I think it's one of the tragedies of history that Mao several times tried to get help from the United States to bolster him against Stalin, and we turned him down. Then in 1946, I twice translated messages from Mao. Same message. In 5 years, we expect to be in power over all of China. And when that happens, we want normal relations with the United States for two reasons. First, because after World War II, you're the only country that has the money to give us construction loans. Two, we do not want to be unilaterally dependent on the Soviet Union, because while they're our comrades, in many basic viewpoints, we do not share their viewpoint. So we'd like to be able to deal with both worlds. And we turned him down. We slammed the door in his face.
The US government sympathized with the Chinese nationalists and wanted to stabilize Chiang Kai-shek's regime. A final American attempt at mediation actually led to a ceasefire. On Mao's behalf, in the presence of George C. Marshall, who later became US Defense Secretary, Zhou Enlai signed the document. It was planned to establish a coalition government comprised of various parties. But shortly afterwards, the two arch-enemies broke their alliance. In autumn 1948, Mao planned his decisive campaign against the Kuomintang.
The war between Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communists was close to being decided. 300 kilometers north of Nanking, nearly 600,000 Chinese national troops were surrounded. Fierce fighting was taking place on all fronts.
The civil war took a fateful twist for the Kuomintang. Many of its troops defected to the communists. The leadership of the right-wing Kuomintang was regarded as corrupt and unscrupulous. 1 million soldiers had already surrendered.
The spoils of war taken from the government troops included heavy machine guns from Russia and weapons from Czechoslovakia. New defense plans were being discussed and new measures sought in order to avert the impending danger at the last moment.
The new tactic employed by the People's Liberation Army, as the Red Army now called itself, was to reconquer China's major cities. In order to win through, like here in Shanghai, the nationalists were absolutely ruthless. Anyone who was even suspected of being a communist was summarily executed. In spring 1949, the imperial city of Beijing fell to the communists. People's Liberation Army troops then headed south and registered one success after another. Many foreign nationals left the country in panic. Army commander Lin Biao had already taken the whole of Manchuria. By now, the People's Liberation Army consisted of more than 1 million battle-tested soldiers, and it also had heavy weapons. The Kuomintang forces, however, had been virtually wiped out. Shanghai was one of the last cities to be conquered by Mao's army.
The success of the communist troops in the Civil War, which only became a certainty from mid-1947, can certainly not be attributed to one single reason. The fact that the communist troops took a far more civil approach to the populace played a role. So did the fact that they were a more unified body, and that they succeeded in developing a vision of the future which many more people shared. But it also had to do with the resoluteness of the two parties. With Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, there were many groups within the party, and this led to several conflicts. By comparison, since the 1940s at the latest, the Communist Party presented an extremely closed and united front behind Mao. So it had no frictional losses in the sense of leadership conflicts. In the final analysis, this war was also decided to a large extent through concrete errors on the battleground. Strategic misjudgments took place. Consequently, in many battles, the decisions taken by the communists were simply better.
Chiang Kai-shek was beaten. In the meantime, the Generalissimo had retreated to the island of Taiwan and set up a new headquarters. The Republic of China, he proclaimed, still exists today. Millions of Kuomintang soldiers were taken prisoner. The Chinese Civil War claimed at least 1 million lives. The glorious entry of the People's Liberation Army into Beijing, staged in perfect propaganda style. Mao Zedong had finally won the battle for China. But it would still take a few years before all areas of this huge country were under communist control. Mao had achieved his goal. Beijing, the seat of the Emperor of China for thousands of years, was to be his new capital.